All right, bioethics, welcome back. This is the lesson for Thursday, March 26th. So we're looking at gender theory again, this time in a different way. So first up, we're looking at scientific studies on gender and gender transitioning. That's our main goal today. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to review relativism and moral relativism briefly. Then we're going to examine specific scientific studies about first gender and sex, then international scientific studies on transgenderism and the effects of gender transitioning and the causes of gender transitioning. So we're going to look at the science, at least the science that we have, and then we're going to talk about a little bit about the ethics on, say, gender transitioning treatment, and specifically gender transitioning treatment for children. So let's start. Remember, relativism is a belief that there is no absolute truth, but this seems silly because if you claim there is no absolute truth, then you're claiming that at least that is absolutely true, right? So clearly there is some kind of absolute truth. Even in the realm of morality, right? We know that it's objectively bad to murder, it's objectively bad to kidnap, these sort of things, right? So a good argument for, gender ideas or gender theory or transgender transitioning, these sort of things should not come from the idea that, well, everything's relative, anyone can do whatever they want and it's good or it's bad. We need to talk about from an objective stance. So, clarification, God loves everyone. Everyone's called to get to heaven. You should be very kind and respectful when you talk to anyone about anything, right? So when we talk about issues like gender theory, we need to be very kind and considerate to the people we talk with. So we're going to look at studies today, scientific evidence. So let's begin. The first study, all right, will come after here. But first, let's talk about what is gender dysphoria. So I've linked here a link to the American Psychiatric Association, the APA, you've probably heard of it, the sort of leading experts in America on psychology and psychiatry. So they define gender dysphoria like this. Gender dysphoria involves a conflict between a person's physical or assigned gender and the gender with which he or she identifies. People with gender dysphoria may be very uncomfortable with the gender they were assigned, sometimes described as being uncomfortable with their body, or being uncomfortable with the expected roles of their assigned gender. All right, so this seems like a pretty good definition of gender dysphoria, right? Dysphoria having to do with sort of a disconnect, like, well, it looks like this, but it's actually like this, right? So it's a conflict between their physical or assigned gender and the gender which they identify with, right? So their gender identity and their gender, or their gender identity and their sex. There's a conflict. That's what gender dysphoria is. So, first, the biology of sexual identity, right? Every cell in a person's body has the same set of 46 chromosomes. It's XX or it's XY, right? If you're a woman, it's XX. If you're a man, it's XY. There's a few exceptions, right? Turner syndrome, I know even some people who've gone to Dowling have had Turner syndrome, and so maybe one of your relatives has it. It's relatively rare, but it's not so rare, where a woman has just one X chromosome. It leads to them looking sometimes very childlike. It can lead to sort of early onset menopause, these sort of things, but clearly female, right? Female anatomy, female sexual organs, just X chromosomes, no Y chromosomes. And so, although it's a genetic mutation, this person is clearly still female. We also have Klinefelter's syndrome, XXY, right, which usually still exhibits female anatomy, female hormones, these sort of things, with the introduction of a Y chromosome. And so, while there are rare genetic mutations and exceptions, generally speaking, everyone is XX or XY, right? And that's the biology of it, right? So you are born at least with a sex that is, say, definite, right? You have a biological sex that you're born with, and that cannot change. That's sex specifically, but how does gender relate to that? When we talk about scientific studies on gender transitioning, many of them are examining the efficacy of gender transitioning treatment in improving the health of people with gender dysphoria, right? Which makes sense. That's what you'd want to study, right? How does psychological care help to improve these people's lives? How does like a transitioning surgery, does that improve their lives? Right, those sort of questions. And so when it comes to these studies, they are studies which are examining the things which doctors are doing, right? And doctors do medicine. So we got to talk about what is the purpose of medicine. You've heard this before, right? The purpose of medicine is to treat and cure disease and promote health, right? Clearly, all medicine is for that. If you go to the doctor and they give you a drug or they perform a surgery, it's to treat or cure a disease or to promote your health. Otherwise, it's not medicine, right? So when we keep this in mind, when we talk about the ethics of gender transitioning treatment, we need to be sure that any treatment that would be happening is treating or curing a disease or is promoting one's health. Because if it's not doing those things, it should not be done, right? If it's not treating or curing a disease or promoting your health, it's bad, right? If you go to the doctor with a cough and they say, oh, we're going to do some bloodletting, and they, open your veins and let some blood out, and they say, all better. That's not medicine. It didn't treat or cure your cough, and it didn't promote your health, right? Now, I mean, if you have a high iron levels in your bloodletting might work, but not for a cough, right? So the treatment has to be appropriate, or it's unethical. All right, so first resource. All right, now in the PowerPoint, you can click all these links. It's posted to topics, and you can find all the studies. They're all linked. Anything with an underline has a link to a study. So, according to a recent estimate, about 0.6% of adults in the U.S. identify as a gender that does not correspond to their sex, right? So if their biological sex is XY male, 0.6 might identify as female or something else, right? There's an idea that gender identity is an innate, fixed properties of human beings that is independent of one's sex. Meaning, okay, yes, your sex is XY, male, but you're born with this innate XX female mind or self, right? Even though your body is male, you are actually female gender, right? This is one idea, that it's innate and you're born with it. But we're going to look at some studies that suggest that might not be the case, that it might not be something which you're born with or which is innate, right? When you look at studies, which we will, that compare the brain structures of people who identify as transgender and people who don't, there's very, very weak correlations between brain structure and cross-gender identification. Meaning, if a person who has the sex of male, who identifies as female, has a brain scan, that brain scan generally suggests male, right? It doesn't suggest female. So one piece of evidence for the idea that one is, born with a different gender to their sex would be to say, actually their brain structure is female, but that isn't the case, right? And you can find the link here, right? So we don't see good evidence that people who deal with gender dysphoria have different brains, right? That their brain is actually a different gender than their sex. Secondly, all right, there's been identical twin studies, right? So identical twins are almost identical down to the DNA level, right? If gender was innate, right? If it had to do with something in the brain, if it was something you were born with, we would expect a very, very high number of identical twins to exhibit the same thing. So if one identical twin had gender dysphoria or was transgender, we would expect the other twin to be the same. But we don't see that, right? We see about 28% of the time both twins being transgender, right? But not 100%, not 75%, not 50%. There's another uncontrolled variable in these studies, which is they grow up in the same home usually, right? Nurture. So if it's nature, we'd expect a very, very high number of twins, even maybe siblings, to identify as transgender. But that sort of data can be clouded by the fact that these children are usually raised in the same home. So if it was somehow like a societal imposed thing that gender is different than the sex, we wouldn't be able to control for that in the studies. So the only way to get a really good study out of identical twin studies would be to take identical twins, separate them at birth, raise one in a home where the idea that your gender can be different from your sex is accepted, and one in a home where it's not, and see what happens. But Generally, separating children at birth for the sake of science is unethical. So we don't have those kind of studies. But the UK has an interesting study about nature versus nurture in gender dysphoria, right? Are people born with a gender identity different to their biological sex? The UK did a study on the effects of children being exposed to people with gender dysphoria, right? So children being exposed to people who have a biological sex that is different from their gender identity. And they found that 87% of children studied became gender dysphoric only after one of their friends became gender dysphoric, or they read about someone becoming gender dysphoric online, or both. Meaning only 13% of children identified with gender dysphoria without first being exposed to it by their friends or by the media. And we would expect the number to be not that. We would expect the number to be the same no matter what, right? If someone has a gender in their mind, which is different from their biological sex, we would expect that to be just there, right? That you wouldn't need to be exposed to someone else to know that your gender is different, right? Because all of these children were asked, like, okay, well, your sex is male, you're a boy, right? Do you identify as a boy or a girl? Well, you would expect if really in their head they were born with a different gender, that they would say, well, I feel like a girl. But we see that 87% of children only do that once they've been influenced by their friends or someone online. We also see that it affects girls much more than boys. And they give no sort of reason for why that is, but that's just a fact to look at. You can find the study linked in the little research here, the underlined part. So, there's a lot of research that shows that the child's environment affects how they view sexual identity and gender. Right? We see no real writing on the idea that one's sex might be different from one's gender until very recently, right? Until the 20th and 21st century. If, say, 0.6 or 1% or 5% or whatever percent of people are born with a gender different from their biological sex, we would expect to see that throughout history. We would expect to see people writing about it, right? Writing, say, plenty of educated people have written throughout history, and they don't write that, well, while I am a man, I feel as though I ought to be a woman, or I feel as though I really am a woman. Right? We don't see that anywhere in writing throughout history until recently. And that lends some credence to the idea that society has an impact on one's identity and gender. All right. We know, for example, that if a male child shows a preference for female toys, right? If a male child wants to play with Barbies instead of trucks or whatever, that doesn't mean he's a girl, right? The sort of toys you play with don't identify you, right? In fact, that would reinforce gender stereotypes and norms, which would be bad, right? Like boys can play with whatever toys they want, girls can play with whatever toys they want. So there's not a lot of good evidence in scientific studies that children, for example, who are young, have been born with a different gender to their sex. All right. There's not really good evidence for that. So we then have to come to the conclusion that perhaps society and, the country and the culture influence how people identify with their gender. So all that aside, let's talk about some research over people's mental health and physical health after gender reassignment surgery. There's not a whole lot of research that's been done. All right. And the research is sort of difficult because it's not as though a research firm or a scientist has, found every person who's undergone gender transition surgery and then interviewed them with the same questions. And it's also sort of difficult because it's sort of like a social science, right? If I do a chemistry study, I can say, does this reaction happen? Right? And I can do it 100 times in the lab, and I can say, yep, at 97 times it happens, so it happens. When it comes to things like interviews and psychology and questions, you're asking people to self-report. And so you're asking people, how do you feel? Do they always tell the truth? No. Right? So how do you account for asking questions in such a way that you try and get as much truth out of it? in reaching out to people, say, like, would you please answer these questions? Not everyone does, right? And so the data has to be taken with a grain of salt, right? It's individuals self-reporting on their experiences, which may or may not eliminate individuals who don't want to participate because they feel poorly about it or they feel very good about it. So these studies sort of have maybe significantly large margins of error that we have to work with on either side of the aisle here. So here's the first study from Sweden. It's a long-term follow-up of transsexual persons who underwent sex reassignment surgery. All right, you can find the link there when you click Sweden. Here's the conclusions. Persons with what they call transsexualism, which we usually in America call transgenderism or gender dysphoria, after sexual reassignment have higher risks of mortality, suicidal behavior, and psychiatric morbidity than the general population. All right. The findings suggest that sex reassignment, although alleviating gender dysphoria, may not suffice as treatment for transsexualism and should inspire improved psychiatric and somatic care after sex reassignment. And so this study suggests that the sexual reassignment surgery can improve one's issues with gender dysphoria, right? It can make the gender dysphoria somewhat better, but it doesn't necessarily improve their mental health. Right, it doesn't necessarily lower their suicide rate or lower their what they call psychiatric morbidity or their risk of mortality. Right, so although it alleviates the gender dysphoria in some individuals, it doesn't actually lead to lower suicide rates, which you would expect if it was an adequate treatment. If it was promoting these individuals' mental health, you would expect to see lower suicide rates. But this study from Sweden does not see that. Right, and so this study suggests that as like a mental health treatment, the gender reassignment surgery is not adequate, right? Because it's not improving their health. So that's one study. All right. There's some studies about children who undergo not necessarily gender reassignment surgery, but treatment, like hormonal treatment, these sort of things. One study here, which you can find linked, shows that only a minority of children who experience transgender identifications continue to do so into adolescence or adulthood. That means this. If you have, say, 10 children who are, while children, identifying as a different gender, only a minority, so only like 4 or less of them, will continue to do so into adolescence or adulthood. So if you have 10, 12-year-olds, by the time they're 18, the majority of them will no longer identify with a different gender to their sex, but identify with the same gender as their sex. All right, which means there's little good reason to prescribe gender reassignment surgery or hormone treatment for children if the majority of children change their mind in adolescence or adulthood. All right, if we took those 10 children and gave them hormones to suppress puberty or gave them gender reassignment surgery, the majority of them would regret their decision as they would become identifying with the same gender as their sex, right? And so when it comes to the ethics of like gender reassignment surgery, one might argue that, well, an adult can have whatever elective surgery they like, right? If an adult wants to have plastic surgery of any type, then just let them do it. And that could be an argument, right? Are they hurting anyone else? No. You can talk about, is this good medicine? But that's its own issue. But here when we talk about children, the ethics seem fairly clear, right? If the majority of children change their mind, if the majority of children who identify as a different gender cease identifying as a different gender into adolescence and adulthood, then it seems unethical that we should give them gender reassignment surgery or hormone therapy as children. All right, since it doesn't improve their psychological well-being in the long term. All right, there is no evidence that children who express, gender dysphoria or transgender ideas should be encouraged to engage in the surgery or hormone treatment. There's also an issue beyond the majority of them change their mind that, would it be ethical for someone to perform plastic surgery on a child? right? Or would it be ethical for someone to just give hormone therapy to a child who may or may not have, you know, their frontal cortex developed enough to use good reason, right? If your 7-year-old says, you know, I want plastic surgery, you would say no, right? Well, if your 7-year-old identifies as a different gender, it seems like, regardless of the reason, the elective surgery like that would still be a no, right? Until their brain is developed enough to make good decisions, at least for themselves, right? We've also seen what Dr. Paul McHugh of Johns Hopkins said. Now I've linked the studies he looked at here, right? He says, at least in ethics in regards to what doctors have to do, that it's the duty of doctors to propose a treatment to treat the nature of the problem, that it has to treat or cure the disease. And he says the studies don't show that gender reassignment surgery treats the condition of gender dysphoria, that it treats the mental health issues associated with gender dysphoria, right? The gender reassignment surgery does not improve the suicide rates, right? It doesn't improve mental health per se. And these are the studies he looked at. All right. You can find these on OnCampus in the notes. Now, for your homework, here's what I want you to do. I want you to read one of these studies, any of the studies linked, all right, and I want you to look at their methods and their abstract, and I want you to analyze, was this a good study? Did they control for the right variables? And does this study really prove their claim? All right, any of the studies linked, you can do any of them. Now, you'll find a discussion board, all right, so I can close this here. You'll find a discussion board on OnCampus. You can go to assignments. Now this one is assigned on Thursday, so for me, I'll have to hit future. And you can click on it, and you'll see it here. All right, you have to read one of the peer-reviewed studies, post 3 or more sentences about why you think it proves its claim or why it doesn't prove its claim, and then post 2 replies to your peers about agreeing or disagreeing with their reasoning. So if one of your peers makes a logical error, they don't make a valid argument, you should say, here's why I don't think your argument's valid. Or if one of your peers makes a valid argument, you should say, here's why I think it's valid, right? Remember to be respectful in your discussions, and you may be mixed with other bioethics students who are not normally in your section. All right, so get that done. That will be due Tuesday, March 31st, the last day of March, and I'll see you on Tuesday.